Alaska is a place that doesn't just contain the wilderness. It is the wilderness. Out there, beyond the reach of the paved roads and the flickering hum of the power lines, the land has a memory that stretches back long before humans ever thought to put a name to it. I've lived in the interior for most of my life, working as a seasonal surveyor for the Department of Natural Resources. My job usually involves flying out to remote sections of the Brooks Range, setting up a temporary camp, and mapping the shifts in the permafrost. It's a lonely existence, but I've always preferred the company of the mountains to the noise of the city. However, what happened 2 years ago near the headwaters of the Noatak River changed the way I look at the horizon. It made me realize that some parts of the earth were never meant to be mapped. It was late October, a time when the sun is a fleeting guest and the temperature drops so fast it feels like the air is shattering. I was stationed at a small, reinforced weather shack, a structure no bigger than a shipping container, bolted to the side of a granite ridge. I was alone, with my only connection to the outside world being a satellite phone that worked about 40% of the time. The plan was to stay for 10 days, collect the core samples, and wait for the bush pilot to pick me up. But on the third evening, the wind shifted. It didn't just blow, it screamed, bringing with it a whiteout so thick I couldn't see the railing of the porch 2 feet from the door. I was sitting at my small wooden desk, cataloging the day's data by the light of a battery-powered lantern, when I heard the first vibration. It wasn't a sound you hear with your ears, it was something you feel in your marrow. It was a heavy, rhythmic weight pressing against the side of the shack. I told myself it was the wind pack shifting against the foundation, or perhaps a stray boulder being pushed by the gale. But then the rhythm changed. It became deliberate. It felt like something was walking around the perimeter of the building, checking the strength of the bolts. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs, and moved toward the small, double-paned window. I wiped the frost away with my sleeve and peered out into the swirling white chaos. For a second, the wind died down just enough for me to see the edge of the ridge. Standing there, barely 10 yards away, was a shape that shouldn't have existed. It was tall, perhaps 9 or 10 feet, and so thin it looked like a shadow stretched thin. It didn't have fur or clothes. Its skin was the color of a bruised winter sky, a pale, translucent blue that seemed to absorb the little light left in the world. It didn't move like an animal. It moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, its limbs unfolding like the legs of an insect. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps. I didn't reach for my rifle. Something about the sight of that thing made me feel like a weapon was a childish toy. I stood in the center of the room, listening as the weight moved from the walls to the roof. The metal ceiling groaned under the pressure. I could hear the sound of long, sharp points dragging across the corrugated steel, a slow, agonizing scrape that lasted for minutes. The most disturbing part wasn't the movement, though. It was the silence that followed. For nearly an hour, there was no wind, no scraping, no footsteps. There was only the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. Then, in the middle of that oppressive quiet, a voice drifted through the vent in the ceiling. It wasn't a growl or a hiss. It was the voice of my father. My father had passed away in a hospital in Fairbanks 3 years prior. But out there, in the middle of a nameless ridge in the Brooks Range, I heard him as clearly as if he were standing in the room with me. He didn't say my name. He just started reciting a list of groceries. Milk, bread, eggs, coffee, tobacco. He was repeating the last list I had written for him before he got sick. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, like a recording being played at the wrong speed. I slumped into my chair, covering my ears with my hands, but the voice didn't stop. It began to shift, merging with the voice of the bush pilot who was supposed to pick me up, then the voice of my ex-wife, then finally my own voice. It was as if the thing on the roof was trying on my memories like pieces of clothing, searching for a fit. "The ice is thin today, Gabe," my own voice whispered from the vent. "You should come out and check the sensors." It's much warmer out here than you think. I knew better than to answer. I'd heard the stories from the elders in the coastal villages, stories about the things that live in the high places, the ones who have no names, because to name them is to invite them in. They don't want to eat you, they want to be you. They are empty things, hollow vessels of the frost that need a soul to fill the void. I sat in that chair for the rest of the night, watching the door handle. I didn't see it turn, but I felt the pressure against the frame, a slow, insistent push that made the wood creak and the hinges moan. When the first gray light of morning began to bleed through the window, the weight on the roof finally vanished. The wind picked up again, a normal, biting Alaskan wind that felt like a blessing compared to the silence of the night. I waited until noon before I dared to open the door. I stepped out onto the porch, my rifle finally in my hand, and looked at the snow. There were no footprints. Not a single indentation in the fresh powder, but when I looked at the side of the shack, I saw something that made me drop to my knees. Pressed into the frozen metal of the wall, at the height of a man's head, were hundreds of tiny, frost-etched patterns. They weren't random. They were the exact shape of my own fingerprints. Every whorl, every line, every scar on my hands had been perfectly replicated on the outside of the building, as if something had been pressing its palms against the wall all night, trying to absorb my identity through the steel. I didn't wait for the pilot. I packed my essential gear, triggered the emergency beacon on the satellite phone, and started hiking south toward the nearest mining outpost. It was a 40-mile trek through some of the most brutal terrain on the planet, but I would have walked to the North Pole before I spent another night in that shack. I didn't look back once, even when I felt the temperature drop and the wind start to carry that rhythmic, heavy vibration again. I was found 2 days later by a search and rescue team. They treated me for severe hypothermia and exhaustion, telling me I was lucky to be alive. They sent a crew out to the shack to recover the equipment, but when they got there, they reported that the building was gone. Not destroyed, not blown away, just gone. The bolts had been unscrewed from the granite as if by a giant wrench, and the entire structure had vanished into the mountains. I don't work for the Department of Natural Resources anymore. I live in a small town in the lower 48, in a house surrounded by neighbors and streetlights. I don't like the cold, and I keep my thermostat turned up so high my friends complain about the heat. But sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, when the air in the room gets a little too still, I'll hear a sound from the hallway. It's not a footstep, and it's not the house settling. It's the sound of a voice I haven't heard in years, whispering a grocery list I haven't thought about since I was a young man. I don't open the door. I just sit in my bed and watch the walls, waiting for the frost to start forming in the shape of my own face. Because in Alaska, the land doesn't just remember you. It keeps a part of you, and eventually it always comes back to claim the rest of the manifest. The mountains don't have a voice of their own, so they use yours to tell you when your time is up. I'm just waiting to see whose voice I'll be using when I finally decide to walk back into the white. I spent 12 years working the deck of a crabber called the Arctic Rose, a 60-foot rusted bucket of bolts that smelled permanently of diesel and old brine. Most people think the danger of crab fishing is the waves or the freezing spray, and they aren't wrong. But there is a different kind of danger that comes when you're 500 miles from the nearest coastline and the sun hasn't shown its face in 3 weeks. It's a psychological grinding, a slow erosion of your sanity caused by the endless horizon and the rhythmic, bone-deep vibration of the engine. It was late November, the tail end of a brutal king crab season. We were short-staffed and running on fumes, pushing further west than we usually dared, chasing a disappearing haul. The captain was a man named Elias, a veteran of the Aleutian waters who had more scar tissue than skin. He was obsessed with hitting our quota before the winter pack ice closed the shipping lanes. On the final night of the run, the sea was unnaturally calm, what we call a glass graveyard. There wasn't a breath of wind, and the water was so dark and still, it looked like we were sailing across a lake of ink. We were hauling the last string of pots when the winch began to groan. It was a heavy, metallic strain that vibrated through the steel deck and into the soles of my boots. Whatever was in that pot was far heavier than a few dozen crabs. Elias leaned out of the bridge window, his face illuminated by the sickly green glow of the radar screen. He told us to keep hauling, his voice raspy from a week of shouting over the gale. As the pot broke the surface, the water didn't splash. It seemed to slide off the cage like oil. When we swung the pot onto the sorting table, the crew went silent. There weren't any crabs. There wasn't even any kelp or sea debris. Inside the cage sat a single, perfectly spherical object about the size of a bowling ball. It was made of a material that looked like polished obsidian, but it didn't reflect the deck lights. It seemed to drink the light, creating a hole in the air that was darker than the night around us. It was covered in a fine, gray silt that smelled of old copper and something ancient, something that had never seen the sun. Elias came down from the bridge, his curiosity overriding his caution. He reached into the cage and touched the sphere. The moment his fingers made contact, the engine of the Arctic Rose didn't just stall, it died with a suddenness that made my ears pop. The constant vibration we had lived with for months vanished, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. We were drifting in the middle of the Bering Sea, powerless, with an object on our table that felt like it was pulling the heat right out of the air. Elias didn't pull his hand away. He stood there, his eyes glazing over, staring into the black surface of the sphere. He started to whisper, a low, rapid-fire muttering that didn't sound like any language I'd ever heard. It was a series of liquid consonants and guttural clicks that seemed to vibrate in the back of my own throat. I grabbed his shoulder to pull him back, but his skin was as cold as the sea, and his muscles were as rigid as iron. The rest of the night became a blur of escalating dread. Without the engine, the ship began to lose its battle with the cold. The internal heaters failed, and a layer of frost began to creep across the bulkheads, forming patterns that looked like reaching fingers. One by one, the other deckhands retreated to the galley, terrified by the captain's trance. I stayed on deck, keeping a distance from the table, watching as the glass graveyard around us began to change. The water didn't stay still. It started to churn, but not from wind or current. Small, bioluminescent shapes began to rise from the depths, circling the Arctic Rose. They weren't fish. They looked like long, translucent ribbons of light, miles long, undulating just beneath the surface. They were congregating under the ship, drawn to the sphere on our deck like moths to a flame. The light they cast was a cold, pale violet that turned the frost on our ship into a shimmering, ghostly shroud. By the middle of the night, Elias finally spoke a word I understood. He looked up from the sphere, his eyes now entirely black, the pupils having swallowed the iris. He looked at me and said, "The anchor is up." I asked him what he meant, but he didn't answer. He picked up the sphere, which must have weighed 100 pounds as if it were a feather, and walked to the edge of the railing. He didn't drop it. He stepped off the deck and into the water. There was no splash. He simply merged with the black surface, vanishing instantly into the violet glow beneath. Panic finally took hold of me. I ran to the galley to wake the others, but when I opened the door, the room was empty. The coffee was still steaming on the table, and their coats were still hanging on the hooks, but the men were gone. I searched every inch of the 60-foot boat, from the engine room to the storage lockers. I was alone on a dead ship in the middle of a glowing sea. I returned to the bridge, desperate to find some way to signal for help. The satellite phone was dead. The radio was a hiss of static that sounded like 1,000 voices whispering at once. I looked out the front window and realized the horizon was gone. The violet light from the water had risen into the air, creating a dome of shimmering mist that blocked out the stars. We weren't drifting anymore. The Arctic Rose was moving, being pulled by those ribbons of light toward something in the distance. Out of the mist, a structure began to emerge. It wasn't a landmass. It was a spire, a jagged needle of that same obsidian material, rising hundreds of feet out of the water. It was covered in thousands of shipwrecks, hundreds of years of maritime history pinned to the stone like insects in a collection. I saw ancient wooden galleons, rusted tankers from the 50s, and small fishing boats like ours, all held aloft by some unseen force. As the Arctic Rose was drawn closer to the spire, I saw the people. They were standing on the decks of their respective ships, thousands of them, all perfectly preserved in the freezing air. They weren't moving, but they were all looking in the same direction down. I looked over the railing of my own ship and saw the base of the spire beneath the water. It wasn't stone. It was a mountain of those black spheres, millions of them, pulsating with a rhythmic, low-frequency hum that I could feel in my teeth. Just as the hull of my ship made contact with the spire, a sudden, violent surge of heat bloomed in my chest. I remembered the emergency flare in my pocket. I didn't think. I just acted. I aimed the flare at the obsidian spire and pulled the trigger. The burst of magnesium red light was like a scream in a silent room. The moment the red light hit the black stone, the violet mist shattered. The ribbons of light beneath the water recoiled as if burned. The world tilted. The sound of the engine suddenly roared to life, a deafening, beautiful mechanical scream that shook the ship back to reality. The obsidian spire vanished as if it had been made of smoke. I was back in the glass graveyard, the sun just beginning to peek over the eastern horizon in a thin, cold line of gray. I didn't wait to see if the others would reappear. I jammed the throttle forward and steered the Arctic Rose toward the east, pushing the engine until the needle was deep in the red. I didn't stop until I saw the first rocky outcroppings of the Alaskan coast. When I finally reached the harbor at Dutch Harbor, the authorities boarded the ship. They found me huddled in the corner of the bridge, refusing to let go of the wheel. They asked where the rest of the crew was. I couldn't tell them. I didn't have the words. They searched the ship and found no sign of a struggle, no blood, no reason for 4 men to vanish off a perfectly functional vessel. They treated me for a fugue state brought on by extreme exhaustion and cold. They eventually declared the others lost at sea, victims of a rogue wave or a freak accident. I moved inland, as far from the coast as I could get, finding work in a warehouse in the high desert of Nevada. I thought I was safe. I thought the distance would protect me. But every year, as November rolls around and the air gets that specific, sharp bite of winter, things start to change. I'll be standing in my kitchen or walking through a parking lot, and the sound of the world will suddenly cut out, replaced by that heavy, breathless silence. I'll look down at my hands and see a fine, gray silt under my fingernails, silt that smells like old copper and dead salt. And lately, when I look at my reflection in the window at night, I don't see my own face anymore. I see the Arctic Rose drifting in a violet mist, and I see myself standing on the deck, looking down into the water, waiting for the rest of the anchor to be hauled up. The sea doesn't just take what it wants. It keeps a copy of you, and I'm starting to realize that the version of me sitting here in the desert is the one that's actually underwater. I've spent half my life in the seat of a de Havilland Beaver, flying the kind of routes that make most commercial pilots break out in a cold sweat. In Alaska, the sky isn't just a place where you fly. It's a temperamental beast that can turn on you in the heartbeat of a piston. My name is Silas, and for 20 years, I was the primary supply link for the tiny, off-grid communities scattered across the Seward Peninsula. I've flown through willow-wah winds that tried to flip my plane like a coin, and I've landed on frozen lakes so smooth they felt like greased glass. You develop a sixth sense out here. You learn to read the clouds like a book and listen to the engine like it's your own pulse. But nothing in 2 decades of flying prepared me for the day the map stopped matching the world. It was late September, during that transitional season when the tundra turns a deep, bloody red and the sun begins its long retreat for the winter. I was carrying a load of medical supplies and canned goods from Nome to a private research outpost near the base of the Kigluake Mountains. The weather report was clear when I took off in the early afternoon, but by the time I crossed the Immersive Basin, the sky had turned a sickly, bruised shade of yellow. A massive wall of fog, what we call a sea smoke, rolled in from the coast with an impossible speed. Within minutes, I was flying blind in a world of white cotton. I checked my instruments, expecting the usual magnetic interference you get in the high north, but my compass was doing something I'd never seen. The needle wasn't just spinning, it was vibrating so violently it looked like a blur. My GPS screen flickered and then went completely dark, replaced by a single line of text that read, "Waypoint not found." I tried to bank left to head back toward the coast, but the horizon was gone. There was no up, no down, just the drone of the engine and the suffocating white. I must have been flying in that void for nearly an hour, watching my fuel gauge tick down with a steady, agonizing persistence. I knew if I didn't find a hole in the clouds soon, I'd be dead. Just as I was preparing to ditch the plane in whatever lay beneath me, the fog vanished. It didn't dissipate. It simply ended, as if I had flown through a curtain. I was no longer over the tundra. Below me was a valley that shouldn't have existed. It was a massive, perfectly circular basin, surrounded by peaks that were far higher and more jagged than anything on the maps of the Kiglawake Range. But it was the structures in the valley that made my blood run cold. Rising from the floor of the basin were hundreds of massive, white arches. From my altitude, they looked exactly like the rib cages of some colossal, prehistoric animal, each one spanning nearly half a mile. They were made of a material that looked like polished bone, reflecting the pale light of the evening sun in a way that felt wrong, as if the light were being sucked into the marrow. In the center of these arches sat a single, paved landing strip. It was pristine, without a single crack or blade of grass growing through it, which is unheard of in the Alaskan bush. There were no lights, no hangars, just a small, wooden, terminal building that looked like it belonged in the 1930s. With my fuel light glowing a steady, ominous red, I had no choice. I lined up the beaver and brought it down. The moment my wheels touched the asphalt, the vibration of the engine changed. It didn't sound like a machine anymore. It sounded like a low, rhythmic moan, as if the plane itself was in pain. I taxied to the terminal and shut down the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. In Alaska, there is always the sound of the wind, the cry of a raven, or the distant crack of ice. But here, the air felt dead. It was heavy and smelled of ozone and ancient dust. I grabbed my survival kit and my flare gun, stepping out onto the wing. The temperature was exactly freezing, not a degree above or below. I walked toward the terminal building. The wood was gray and weathered, but it didn't have any rot. As I reached the door, I saw a logbook hanging from a chain. It was a standard pilot's log, but the pages were made of a thick, parchment-like material. I flipped it open, and my breath hitched. The entries were all in my handwriting. The first entry was dated 20 years ago, the day I got my pilot's license. The second was from 10 years later. The third was from last week, but as I kept flipping, the dates moved into the future. October 2028, May 2035, August 2042. Each entry described a flight that ended at this exact landing strip. The final entry, written in a shaky, desperate scrawl that I knew was mine, was dated today. It said, "The sky is bone. The pilot is the fuel." I dropped the logbook and backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs. That was when I heard the sound of another engine. I looked up and saw a plane breaking through the cloud layer above the valley. It was a de Havilland Beaver, identical to mine, down to the faded red paint on the pontoons. I watched as it circled the ribcage arches and lined up for the runway. I ran to the edge of the strip, waving my arms, screaming for the pilot to turn back, but the plane landed with a perfect, silent grace. It taxied right up next to my own aircraft. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was wearing my flight jacket. He was carrying my survival kit, and as he turned toward me, I saw my own face staring back at me, but it was a version of me that was decades older. His hair was snow white, and his eyes were cloudy with cataracts. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked exhausted. He walked up to me, his boots making a soft, crunching sound on the asphalt, and handed me a set of keys. "It's your turn to maintain the light," he said. His voice was a dry rattle, like dead leaves skittering across a floor. "The valley needs to be fed, Silas. If the light goes out, the sky falls." "What is this place?" I stammered, backing away toward the terminal. "This is the anchor," the older version of me replied. He pointed toward the massive bone arches. "The world is a living thing, and it has a skeleton. We are the ones who keep the marrow flowing. You'll understand soon. You've always been here. You're just finally arriving." He walked past me and entered the terminal. I tried to follow him, but the door slammed shut with a force that shook the building. I pulled at the handle, but it was as if it had been welded into the frame. I turned back to the runway, and my heart stopped. The older man's plane was gone. In its place was a pile of white, powdery ash, and my own plane, the one I had just landed, was starting to change. The metal skin was turning into that same bone-like material. The propellers were elongating, becoming jagged and sharp. The engine was sinking into the fuselage, merging with the seats until the entire craft looked like a giant, mechanical heart, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic glow. I looked up at the sky. The clouds were parting, but there were no stars. Instead, I saw the underside of another valley, identical to this one, hanging directly above me. I could see the ribcage arches, the landing strip, and a tiny red plane sitting on the runway. I realized then that the sky wasn't space. It was just another layer of the skeletal world, stacked infinitely like a deck of cards. I felt a sharp, stinging pain in my chest. I looked down and saw that my flight jacket was starting to turn gray. My skin was becoming pale, the veins beneath the surface glowing with a faint violet light. I wasn't dying. I was being integrated. I was becoming a part of the terminal, a part of the valley, a part of the mechanism that kept the world from collapsing in on itself. I sat down on the edge of the runway, watching as the sun, which wasn't a sun at all, but a glowing hole in the layer above, began to dim. I knew that in a few minutes, the middle of the night would arrive, and the collection would begin. I could hear the sound of 1,000 engines in the distance, 1,000 Silases flying through 1,000 fogs, all of them following a spinning compass toward the only place that makes sense. I reached out and picked up a handful of the dust from the runway. It didn't feel like rock. It felt like crushed teeth. I realized then that the great Alaskan wilderness isn't a place you visit. It's a trap that waits for you to get lonely enough to listen to its call. I'm not a pilot anymore. I'm a lighthouse keeper for a world that doesn't want to be seen. If you're ever flying over the Brooks Range and your compass starts to dance, or if you see a valley filled with white arches that look like ribs, don't try to land. Don't look for a hole in the clouds. Just close your eyes and pray that you have enough fuel to reach the end of the world, because once you touch the bone, the sky doesn't belong to you anymore. The last thing I remember before the light went out completely was the sound of my own voice, coming from the terminal, reciting the coordinates for the next arrival. I'm still here, waiting for the wind to bring me back to myself, but I'm starting to think the man I was is just another ghost in the logbook, and the man I am is just the wind. The horizon isn't a line where the earth meets the sky. It's a mouth that's been waiting for you to fly right in. And out here, in the deep white, there's no such thing as a safe landing, only a long, quiet wait for the rest of the skeleton to find its skin.